In the Pacific, men learned quickly that distance was a luxury and silence was never empty. Somewhere ahead, behind a wall of green or inside a ridge that looked dead, a few seconds of gunfire could decide whether a squad kept moving or stopped forever. The jungle pressed in with wet heat and rot, turning helmets into basins and rifles into things that sweated along with their owners. On islands where the map looked simple, one beach, one ridge, one airstrip, the ground itself argued back. Roots grabbed boots, coral sliced knees, and every rise in terrain felt watched. The enemy was often invisible until the first burst snapped through leaves and the air filled with the smell of powder and churned mud. It was close enough sometimes to hear breathing, close enough to hear a wounded man calling and not know from which fold of earth the voice came. In that kind of fighting, courage was not a shout. It was the slow act of stepping forward when the body wanted to melt into the island and become part of it. American infantry came with faith in firepower, but island warfare taught limits quickly. A bunker with a narrow slit could drink rifle rounds all day and only blink when it wanted to. Mortars could shake a hillside and still leave a mouth of rock open, a position that seemed dead until a machine gun came alive again as if nothing had happened. Artillery was powerful, but it depended on observation and angles that jungle and ridges refused to provide. Even when shells found their mark, caves and dugouts swallowed blast and shrapnel, leaving defenders bruised, deafened, and still capable of killing. Officers used words like neutralized and sealed, terms that sounded clean on a map but dissolved under the reality of positions that kept firing after they were supposedly finished. The ground demanded solutions that could enter the places where steel fragments could not. That was where the flamethrower entered the assault line, not as spectacle but as an admission. It was an answer built from tactical dead ends and casualty lists, from squads pinned in front of openings they could not reach, from men staring at a ridge and realizing that to take it they would have to climb into the enemy's hands. Carried on a man's back, it looked almost crude, tanks of fuel, hoses, valves, a wand that could spit fire for seconds that felt longer than a prayer. The operator moved with the careful stiffness of someone carrying his own catastrophe. Everyone around him knew it too. A flamethrower drew bullets the way a canteen drew thirst. The weapon could solve a problem, but it made a new one in the same breath. It forced a man to walk forward into the exact place where the enemy's aim would be sharpest. For Japanese defenders, the island had been shaped into a fortress of patience. They learned to let bombardments pass like weather, to stay quiet, to save ammunition, to wait until Americans were close enough that grenades and rifle fire would do their work. In caves and bunkers, they lived by the logic that darkness and depth could outlast anything thrown from outside. A position was not merely shelter, it was a contract with time. Flame threatened that bargain. Even unseen, it erased the comfort of corners and tunnels. For Americans, it offered the grim hope that an unseen gun could be forced into silence without another line of bodies in front of it. Both sides sensed the same thing: the war was about to crawl into the dark. The Japanese defensive system was not built for drama, it was built for arithmetic. Every yard of ground was measured in fields of fire, every approach turned into a narrow corridor where rifles, machine guns, and hidden mortars could harvest men at the moment they were most exposed. From above, a position might look like a simple bunker. Up close, it revealed itself as a network: caves cut into limestone, tunnels linking chambers, firing ports angled so that one slit protected another. The defenders were disciplined about concealment. They let bombardments roll over them and learned not to answer stray shots. Silence was part of the fortification, as important as sandbags or rock. When Americans advanced, the Japanese often waited until the line was close enough that the shapes in the foliage became individual bodies, then opened fire with a precision that felt personal, as if the island itself had decided who would fall. This system created a particular kind of frustration for the attackers. A strong point that appeared quiet after an air strike could erupt again as soon as Marines moved across open coral. A cave mouth could be hidden behind a screen of vines, its firing slits so narrow that bullets passed over it without even knowing it existed. Grenades were thrown and detonated, but the blast often vented out, leaving defenders deeper inside, shaken but alive. Demolitions could collapse an entrance, but the Japanese were rarely dependent on a single doorway. They built alternate exits and air holes, small vents that served as lungs for the underground. Clearing a position became a word that lied by omission. It meant taking the surface, not mastering what ran beneath it. A ridge could be taken in the afternoon and become lethal again at dusk when defenders emerged through a different opening to fire into the rear. For Japanese units, concealment was survival and also dignity. They knew they were outgunned in the open, so they refused the open. Their doctrine leaned toward making the enemy come close, making the fight intimate and expensive, forcing American strength to become a liability as units crowded into kill zones. They learned the value of restraint. A single machine gun that fired too early could reveal itself and be smothered by mortars. Better to let the first wave pass, then cut down the men carrying radios, stretchers, and ammunition. Better to wound in the open and fire again when others crawled out to help. In the cool logic of defense, compassion became another weakness to exploit. The flamethrower altered the moral and practical balance of this system without replacing it. It was not a magic weapon. It still needed a path to an opening, and the man carrying it still had to survive long enough to squeeze the trigger. But it represented something the Japanese defenses were not designed to endure, a force that did not depend on direct line-of-sight lethality. Flame could curl into a firing slit, spill down a tunnel, and steal oxygen from chambers that bullets could not reach. Even when it did not kill immediately, it changed the defender's internal geography. Corners became less trustworthy. Depth became less comforting. The cave's promise, time, shelter, patience, began to weaken. For Americans, this realization carried its own unease. They had arrived to fight soldiers, not to burn holes in hillsides and listen for what happened inside. Yet the Japanese system left few alternatives. Each attempt to take a bunker cleanly produced the same result: men cut down by a defender who could not be seen. As the days wore on, flamethrowers felt less like a choice and more like the next step in a narrowing corridor of options. The dread that grew around them was quiet, almost bureaucratic. It was the dread of a tool that solved a tactical problem by entering the one place where human beings believed they could still hide. The attack rhythm changed the moment a flamethrower team stepped into the line. Before, the fight could be a slow exchange of shots and grenades, a brutal patience where both sides waited for a mistake. With flame, time compressed. The weapon demanded coordination, and coordination demanded exposure. Scouts crawled forward to locate apertures that were sometimes no wider than a hand. Riflemen and bar teams watched the slit, not to kill what they could barely see, but to keep it from firing while the specialists moved. Mortar rounds thumped into suspected positions, their fragments chewing leaves and dirt into a fine spray. Men shouted distances and directions in short bursts, voices strained by the need to be heard over gunfire and the instinct not to speak at all. The flamethrower operator was the center of gravity, and he knew it. The tanks on his back made him taller and slower, a silhouette that betrayed itself even when he tried to crouch. The hose snagged on roots. The wand felt heavy, not from its weight but from what it meant, a decision that could not be taken back once the flame began. The operator's escort moved like a bodyguard detail, rifles up, eyes fixed on the places where a Japanese rifleman might be waiting with a single round. The fear around him was practical. A bullet into the tanks was not guaranteed to explode, but the possibility was enough. Men had seen what fire did to a fuel dump, and the imagination did the rest. For Japanese defenders, the approach of a flamethrower was not always visible, but it was often recognizable. The pattern of American fire shifted. More smoke. More suppressive bursts directed at a slit that had previously been ignored because it was too hard to hit. The defenders listened through stone and earth and learned to read vibrations, to tell when boots were close, when men were crawling rather than walking. In those moments, the cave was both protection and prison. The instinct was to hold the firing slit, to keep the Americans pinned. But the knowledge that flame could enter that same slit introduced a new calculation. A man who stayed too long might be trapped by a wall of heat that stole air and turned skin into something that did not feel like skin anymore. When flame finally reached an opening, it did not behave like a clean weapon. It rolled and licked and searched. It filled the mouth of the bunker with a sudden animal brightness, then plunged inward, driven by pressure and the hunger of oxygen. The immediate effect was not always death. Sometimes it was smoke, choking and thick, forcing defenders to retreat deeper or to scramble toward an alternate exit. But retreat was not simple in a crowded tunnel. Wounded men blocked passage. Ammunition boxes caught. Cloth and hair ignited. The cave's darkness, once a companion, became a trap that hit obstacles and turned panic into injury. For the Americans outside, the moment carried a silence that felt wrong. There was no satisfying confirmation, no clear sight of the enemy falling. There was only the roar of the flame and the hiss of burning fuel, then the fading sound of it as the operator released the trigger. Men stared at the entrance, waiting for return fire. Sometimes none came. Sometimes a single rifle shot cracked out, stubborn and thin, as if the cave itself refused to admit defeat. Either way, the weapon had done what bullets struggled to do. It forced a decision inside the rock. It collapsed endurance into seconds. The emotional cost was shared even if it was not spoken. The operator, sweating under the tanks, often looked as shaken as the men he had just burned out. The rifleman who protected him felt the same mixture of relief and nausea. And the Japanese who survived carried a new knowledge into the next fight, that the Americans had found a way to turn darkness against them, and that every tunnel now had an invisible timer ticking down the moment the assault drew near. Once the pattern became clear, Japanese units began to treat flamethrowers as a priority target, not because they were the only threat, but because they broke the defensive bargain the caves were meant to enforce. A flamethrower was not just a man with a weapon. It was a process the Americans relied on to crack positions that would otherwise bleed them. Japanese observers watched for the telltale shape on a ridge line, the awkward high-backed figure moving with escorts. They learned to wait for that moment, to fire not at the first wave of riflemen but at the specialist who would make the cave unlivable. A single bullet into the operator or the hose could stop the sequence. Even if the tanks did not ignite, the team often had to pull back, and in that pause the defense regained time. Inside the caves, adaptation was quiet and methodical. Entrances were reinforced, not only against blast but against the reach of flame. Defenders built baffles, turns in the tunnel, low walls, constrictions, meant to disrupt the flow of heat and burning fuel. They shifted firing positions deeper, using narrow apertures that gave less room for flame to enter. Some units created false openings that drew American attention and flame while the real firing slit remained offset, waiting to reopen once the fuel ran out. They also understood that flame consumed oxygen, and they tried to counter it with air shafts and alternate vents, small lungs that could keep a chamber breathable long enough for men to hold their posts. The battlefield above ground changed accordingly. Americans moved flamethrower teams under heavier cover, using smoke and suppressive fire more aggressively. Engineers became central figures in the assault, carrying satchel charges alongside flamethrowers, learning that a cave might need to be burned, blasted, and sealed in a sequence that left no doubt. Tanks, when terrain allowed, crept forward with infantry clinging to their wake, their machine guns raking foliage while their main guns fired point-blank into embrasures. Yet even with armor, the island could not be forced into simplicity. Japanese anti-tank guns and magnetic mines turned close cooperation into a gamble. Every time a tank moved forward, men felt the same question tightening in their throats: whether the machine would survive long enough to matter. Night brought another layer of response. Japanese infiltration parties slipped through darkness and rain, moving low and silent, seeking the specialists, engineers, flamethrower operators, radio men. They attacked sleeping positions, cut telephone lines, threw grenades into shallow foxholes. The intent was not always to take ground. It was to drain the American assault of its key tools, to make the next day's advance slower and bloodier. For the Americans, this forced a different kind of vigilance. Men slept in snatches. Perimeters tightened. Listening posts lay out in front, tense and motionless, trying to distinguish the rustle of a lizard from the careful movement of a human being. The turning point was not a single battle but a shift in understanding. The Japanese no longer feared the flamethrower as a surprise. They feared it as an organized method, and they tried to break that method at its joints. The Americans, for their part, began to grasp that cleared could never be assumed. A cave that stopped firing might still contain men. A sealed entrance might still be bypassed by a hidden exit. Each success carried the weight of uncertainty, and that uncertainty drove harsher procedures. Positions were revisited, probed, burned again. The ground became a ledger of repeated confirmations. Emotionally, the war darkened in tone. The work of taking an island became less about heroism and more about endurance. And procedure, about men doing unpleasant tasks because the alternative was to lose more friends. The flamethrower remained effective, but its effectiveness pulled everyone into a morally grayer landscape, where the difference between necessity and cruelty could feel thin under the pressure of survival. The Japanese adapted, the Americans adapted in turn, and the fight became a contest not only of weapons but of whether either side could maintain control over fear long enough to keep functioning. After enough caves had been taken, the men began to carry the war in their senses. It was not just the sight of scorched rock or the blackened mouths of bunkers. It was the smell, fuel, smoke, burnt wood, and something else that clung to clothing even after rain. It was the way silence sounded after a position went still, a silence that did not feel peaceful but merely emptied out, as if the island had inhaled and refused to exhale again. Veterans learned that memory could be triggered by small things: a whiff of gasoline near a motor pool, the crackle of a cooking fire, the damp breath of a cave during training. The weapon had done its job, but the job left residue. Operationally, flamethrowers became part of a larger, grinding machine rather than a standalone answer. Units learned to coordinate them with demolitions, tanks, mortars, and relentless small unit pressure. A rifle squad might pin an opening while engineers moved in with satchel charges. A tank would fire into a slit to force defenders back, then the flamethrower would wash the entrance, and finally demolition would collapse the mouth to deny reoccupation. It was combined arms at intimate range, improvised under heat and exhaustion. When it worked, American casualties in certain assaults dropped, not because the enemy was weak, but because the method reduced the time squads had to spend exposed in front of hardened positions. Yet the human consequences did not align neatly with tactical success. The weapon's psychological impact on Japanese troops was real, but it did not always produce surrender. Often it produced something harder, a fatalism that made defenders more determined to hold deeper and longer, to die where they could not be easily reached. Fear could become a kind of fuel of its own. Some defenders withdrew into the far chambers and waited, hoping the Americans would assume the position was finished and move on. Others chose to fight to the last, not out of ignorance of what flame could do, but because the alternatives, capture, retreat through exposed ground, shame, were equally unbearable in their own moral framework. The flamethrower stripped away the cave's promise of safety, but it did not erase the reasons men stayed. For Americans, repeated cave clearing changed discipline in small ways. Procedures became tighter, less tolerant of improvisation that had once been seen as bravery. Men learned to check openings twice, to post guards even after a bunker appeared quiet, to treat every ridge as if it could fire again. This caution was not cowardice, it was the accumulation of lessons paid for in blood. The flamethrower operator, in particular, became a figure marked by contradiction. He was needed, protected, sometimes envied for his ability to end fights quickly, and yet also isolated by the knowledge of what he carried. Some men could not meet his eyes afterward. Others clung to him, grateful because they had seen what happened when a bunker was left intact. The popular myth that terror alone won battles did not hold up under the weight of the campaign. Islands fell because of logistics, artillery, air power, training, and sheer endurance. Flamethrowers were one tool in that larger system, effective because they were integrated into a method that kept pressure constant and reduced the enemy's ability to reset. Still, the weapon left a particular imprint. It turned the act of taking ground into an act of making places uninhabitable. In doing so, it forced both sides to confront the war's most intimate cruelty, not as an exception, but as a recurring procedure written into the daily work of survival. The hidden truth behind Japanese terror of American flamethrowers was not simply fear of pain, as if the battlefield could be reduced to a single instinct. It was fear of losing the one advantage the defensive system promised: control. A cave was more than stone, it was a timetable. It allowed men to decide when to reveal themselves, when to fire, when to withdraw deeper, when to endure bombardment like weather. It offered the illusion that the defender could shape the battle by refusing to be seen. The flamethrower attacked that illusion directly. It did not care about a firing slit's narrowness or the thickness of rock beyond the entrance. It was a weapon that entered the defender's space and stole the basic terms of survival: air, darkness, time. That is why the fear it produced carried a different weight than fear of bullets or shells. Bullets were familiar. A man could flatten himself, take cover, trust that the earth might stop a round meant for his ribs. Shells were monstrous, but they were also distant, a violence that came in waves and could sometimes be waited out. Flame, once it reached an opening, was intimate and invasive. It behaved like a living thing, searching and curling into spaces meant to be protected. It turned the cave's geometry against the men inside, using tunnels as conduits, using corners as traps, consuming oxygen until breathing became work and panic became inevitable. Even when defenders survived the first burst, they emerged changed, carrying the knowledge that their fortress could become an oven with only a few seconds' warning. For Americans, the decision to use flame was bound to the realities of island warfare. They faced positions that could kill dozens of men from a hole in the ground, positions that artillery could not always destroy without line of sight, positions that could be bypassed only at the cost of leaving lethal pockets behind. Flame was a tactical solution to a tactical problem, but it carried moral friction because it made killing feel less like combat and more like extermination of a space. Many infantrymen did not speak about it afterward, not because they doubted the necessity, but because necessity did not make the memory easier to hold. The weapon saved lives in the assault line and scarred the men who used it, both truths living side by side. For Japanese defenders, the choice to fight from caves and bunkers was also a form of necessity, shaped by material shortages, air and naval inferiority, and a doctrine that sought to maximize American losses. In that context, the cave was a rational answer. It offered protection from bombardment, allowed small forces to hold larger ones, and turned terrain into an ally. But it also created conditions where the only effective countermeasures were brutal. Once both sides committed to these methods, the battlefield narrowed into a corridor where humane options became scarce. The flamethrower did not create that scarcity, but it revealed it with terrible clarity. When the islands were finally taken, there was no clean resolution, only an end to immediate resistance and the slow work of counting losses. The ground was quiet, yet the quiet felt crowded with what had happened there. In the aftermath, the flamethrower's legacy remained tangled. An efficient tool, a psychological weapon, a symbol of desperation, and a reminder of how terrain and doctrine can push combat into the darkest corners of human choice. Japanese terror was real, but it was rooted in something deeper than horror alone. It was the terror of a system collapsing, of a defender's last refuge becoming a liability, and of realizing, too late, that the island's strongest places could no longer promise control over death.